Nobody in the studio expected Elvis Presley to stop singing. Not Johnny Carson, not the band, not the thousands of people watching from their seats, and certainly not the little boy who was about to change the entire night with 6 words. Elvis was in the middle of one of the most emotional songs of the evening. The lights were blazing, the cameras were rolling. Johnny Carson stood near the edge of the stage, watching the audience react as Elvis's voice filled the studio. Everything was going exactly as planned, until a small voice suddenly cut through the music. "Elvis!" Elvis kept singing. Then the boy screamed louder, "Elvis, that's my mom's song!" Elvis stopped. Instantly, his fingers froze against the guitar strings. The final note disappeared into the air, and the entire studio went dead silent. It was the kind of silence that felt almost unnatural. Thousands of people were staring at one child. Johnny Carson slowly turned toward him. The musicians looked at one another. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. But Elvis didn't look surprised. He looked concerned. He lowered his microphone. Then he stared directly at the boy. The child was standing beside his father. He couldn't have been very old. His face was red. His eyes were filled with tears. And the moment Elvis saw those tears, something in his expression changed. The performer disappeared. The superstar disappeared. For a few seconds, there was no king of rock and roll. There was only a man looking at a grieving child. Elvis stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "Your mom used to sing this song?" The boy nodded. His lower lip trembled. "Every night?" Elvis didn't answer. He simply stared at him. Because there was something about those 2 words. Every night. Not once, not sometimes. Every night. Elvis slowly crouched down. "What happened, son?" The boy looked toward his father. His father put a hand on his shoulder. The boy swallowed, then whispered the words that changed the entire atmosphere of the studio. "She's gone." Johnny Carson's face fell. The audience became completely still. Elvis looked down for a moment, then back at the child. "How long?" The boy didn't answer immediately. He looked at the floor, then quietly said, "I don't remember exactly." Elvis nodded. He didn't push him. Instead, he asked, "What do you remember?" The boy's eyes filled again. "I remember her voice." Elvis's jaw tightened. The boy continued, "She used to sit beside my bed." Elvis listened. "She would turn off the light." The boy's voice became softer. "And sing that song." Elvis looked at the guitar in his hands, then back at the boy. "Every night?" The boy nodded. "Until I fell asleep." A woman in the audience covered her mouth. Someone behind her began crying. Johnny Carson lowered his head. And Elvis? Elvis looked as though he had forgotten there were cameras in the room, forgotten that millions could be watching. He was no longer thinking about the next line. He was thinking about the little boy standing in front of him, a child who had walked into a television studio carrying a memory too heavy for someone his age. Elvis slowly extended his hand. "Come here, son." The boy hesitated. His father gently encouraged him. The child walked toward the stage, one step, then another. The audience watched as he climbed the stairs. When he reached Elvis, the singer lowered himself again until they were at the same height. Elvis looked directly into his eyes. "What's your name?" The boy answered. Elvis smiled. "That's a good name." Then he asked, "Do you remember how your mom sang the song?" The boy nodded. Elvis waited. "Can you still hear her?" The boy whispered. "Yes." Elvis's eyes softened. "Then I want you to do something for me." The boy looked confused. "What?" Elvis pointed toward the microphone. "Sing it." The boy immediately shook his head. "No." Elvis smiled gently. "You don't have to sing it like me." The boy stared at him. "You don't have to sing it like anybody." Elvis leaned closer. "Sing it like your mom." The boy's eyes widened. The audience became completely silent. Elvis handed him the microphone. The boy held it with both hands. They were shaking. He looked out at the enormous crowd, then at Johnny Carson, then back at Elvis. "I can't." Elvis placed a hand on his shoulder. "Yes, you can." The boy shook his head again. Elvis whispered, "She's the reason you know the song." The boy looked down. "So let her sing through you." That sentence broke him. The boy closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began. The first note was almost impossible to hear. His voice trembled. It wasn't perfect. There was no professional technique, no stage confidence, no polished performance. But there was something far more powerful: memory. The boy sang the way his mother had taught him. And suddenly, Elvis heard something beyond the melody. He heard a mother singing to her child. He heard a bedroom late at night. He heard the quiet before sleep. He heard the sound of someone trying to make a frightened little boy feel safe. Elvis slowly raised his guitar, one chord, then another. He began playing underneath the boy. The audience didn't make a sound. Johnny Carson didn't move. Everyone was watching. The greatest entertainer in the room had stopped being the center of attention. He had become the boy's support. The child continued. His voice grew stronger. And as he sang, something remarkable happened. The fear disappeared. For the first time that night, he wasn't looking at the crowd. He wasn't looking at the cameras. He wasn't even looking at Elvis. He was looking somewhere far away, somewhere only he could see. His mother's face. The boy remembered her sitting beside his bed. He remembered her voice. He remembered the warmth of her hand. He remembered falling asleep while she sang. And for those few minutes, she wasn't gone. She was there. Elvis kept playing, but his eyes were beginning to fill with tears. He looked down at the guitar, blinking slowly, trying to hold himself together. Then the boy reached the hardest part of the song. His voice cracked. He stopped. The studio held its breath. Elvis immediately leaned toward him. "Take your time." The boy looked at him. Elvis nodded. "She's waiting." The boy took another breath and continued. This time his voice was stronger than before, not because the pain had disappeared, but because he was finally allowing himself to feel it. The final note came. The boy's voice faded. Elvis let the last guitar chord ring, then stopped. Silence. Absolute silence. For several seconds, nobody knew what to do. Then, one person stood. Another. Then another. And suddenly, the entire studio erupted. Thunderous applause. People were on their feet. Some were crying openly. Johnny Carson slowly walked toward them. He looked at the boy, then at Elvis. He shook his head. "Elvis." His voice cracked. "I don't even know what to say." Elvis looked at him, then toward the audience and quietly said, "Sometimes," he paused, "you don't need words." The applause slowly faded. Elvis turned toward the boy. There was still one question he needed to ask. He crouched beside him. "What do you miss most about your mom?" The boy stared at Elvis. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he whispered, "Her voice." Elvis's eyes immediately became wet. He looked away, just for a second. Then he looked back. He removed his guitar and placed it in the boy's hands. The boy stared at it in disbelief. "Elvis." Elvis shook his head. "Keep holding it." The boy looked at him. Elvis said, "Whenever you hear this song," he pointed toward the guitar, "remember tonight." The boy's eyes filled with tears. Elvis continued, "And whenever you sing it," he placed his hand over the boy's shoulder, "don't think about losing her." The boy looked confused. Elvis smiled through his own tears. "Think about finding her." The boy suddenly hugged Elvis, hard. Elvis wrapped his arms around him. The audience erupted once again. Johnny Carson turned away. For once, the man known for making millions laugh had nothing funny to say. But then, just when everyone thought the moment was over, Elvis gently pulled back. He looked at the boy. "Would you sing it with me one more time?" The boy stared at him. "You mean, with you?" Elvis smiled. "With me." The boy nodded. Elvis picked up his guitar. The boy stepped beside him. This time he wasn't afraid. The lights came up. The cameras moved closer. Johnny Carson stood completely still, and Elvis began the first chord. The boy opened his mouth and sang. But this time, something was different. He wasn't just singing his mother's song. He was creating a new memory, a memory he would carry for the rest of his life. Elvis looked at him while he sang, and for a brief moment the superstar's expression suggested something deeper. Because Elvis knew something about losing people, something about memories, something about songs that could suddenly bring the past rushing back. And perhaps that's why he stayed beside that little boy. Not as Elvis Presley, not as the king, but simply as a man who understood what it meant to miss someone you could never bring back. The song reached its final moments. The boy looked toward Elvis. Elvis nodded. The boy sang the last line. The guitar faded. The studio waited. Then the boy turned toward Elvis and whispered something that nobody else could hear. Elvis's smile disappeared. His eyes widened. And for the first time that night, Elvis Presley had absolutely no answer. Because what the boy had just told him about his mother was something Elvis never expected to hear. And it would change the meaning of that song forever. The studio was still standing. The applause had faded, but nobody had sat down. Elvis Presley was staring at the little boy. The boy was staring back. And for several seconds, neither of them said a word. Because something had changed. A few moments earlier, the boy had been crying because he missed his mother. Now, Elvis was looking at him as if he had just heard something he couldn't explain. Johnny Carson slowly stepped closer. "What did he say to you?" Elvis didn't answer. He looked at the boy. "Son," the boy tightened his grip around the microphone. "What did you just tell me?" The child looked toward his father. His father seemed confused too. Then the boy whispered, "My mom told me something about you." Elvis froze. Johnny Carson stopped walking. The audience became completely silent again. "About me?" The boy nodded. "She said," he hesitated, "she said if I ever heard this song again." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "I should remember you." Elvis's expression changed. For a moment he almost smiled, but then something in the boy's face told him this wasn't a coincidence. Why would she say that? The boy looked down. "I don't know." Elvis crouched beside him. "Did she know me?" The boy shook his head. "Not like that." "Then what did she mean?" The boy took a breath. "She said you were the reason she learned the song." Elvis stared at him. Johnny Carson looked at Elvis. The band members looked at each other. Nobody understood. Elvis slowly stood. "Your mother learned it from me?" The boy nodded. "She had an old record." Elvis's eyes narrowed. "An old record?" "Yes." The boy continued. "She played it all the time." Elvis looked toward the audience. Something about this was becoming personal, not just emotional. Personal. He turned back to the boy. "Do you remember what the record looked like?" The boy thought for a moment. "Black." Elvis almost laughed softly. "Most records were black, son." The audience gave a nervous little laugh, but the boy didn't smile. "There was a picture of you." Elvis nodded. "Okay. And she kept it in a box." "What kind of box?" "A wooden one." The boy paused. "She told me never to open it." Elvis's smile disappeared. "Why?" The boy shrugged. "She said it belonged to her past." That sentence hung in the air. Johnny Carson looked toward Elvis. "Elvis?" But Elvis raised one hand. He wanted to hear the boy. "What happened to the box?" The boy looked down. "After she died," his voice broke, "my dad put it away." Elvis looked at the father. The father nodded. "We still have it." Elvis took a slow breath, then asked, "Does your father know what's inside?" The man shook his head. "No," the audience murmured. Elvis looked back at the boy. "Do you?" The boy nodded. "A little." "What does that mean?" The child hesitated, then whispered, "There was a letter." The entire studio seemed to shrink around those words. "A letter?" The boy nodded. "My mom wrote it." Elvis's face became serious. "What did it say?" The boy looked toward his father. "I wasn't supposed to read it." Elvis didn't push him, but then the boy said something that made Elvis's eyes widen. "I read it after she died." Johnny Carson took a step forward. "What did the letter say?" The boy swallowed. "It said—" He stopped. His hands began shaking again. Elvis noticed. "You don't have to tell us." The boy looked at him. "No," he shook his head. "I want to." The studio became silent. The boy took a breath. "My mom wrote that." He looked directly into Elvis's eyes. "She wished she could hear you sing this song one more time." Elvis looked down. His fingers slowly tightened around the guitar. The boy continued. "She said it was the last song she ever sang to me." Elvis closed his eyes. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The audience was completely still. Then the boy said, "But there was something else." Elvis opened his eyes. "What?" The boy looked terrified. "She wrote your name?" Elvis stared at him. "My name?" The boy nodded. "Why?" "I don't know." Did she explain? The boy shook his head. She only wrote, he looked at the floor. If he ever hears this, tell him I never forgot. Elvis didn't move. Johnny Carson looked stunned. The cameras were still rolling. The entire country could have been watching. But Elvis seemed to have forgotten all of it. He was thinking about one sentence. Tell him I never forgot. Never forgot what? Who was this woman? Why had she written his name? And why did this song matter so much to her? Elvis slowly walked toward the back of the stage. He stopped, looked down, then turned around. What's your mother's name? The boy told him. Elvis repeated it quietly, once, then again, as if trying to search his own memory. Johnny Carson noticed. You know her? Elvis didn't answer immediately. I don't know. He looked toward the audience. Maybe. The studio reacted with a quiet murmur. Elvis continued. A long time ago. He paused. There were thousands of people who wrote letters. Johnny Carson nodded. Of course. But sometimes, Elvis looked back at the boy. You remember a letter? The boy stared at him. Do you remember hers? Elvis didn't know, not yet. Then the boy suddenly reached into his pocket. I have something. Elvis looked at him. The boy pulled out a small folded piece of paper. The edges were worn. It had clearly been carried many times. What is that? My mom's handwriting. The boy handed it to Elvis. Elvis unfolded it. His eyes moved across the page, one line, then another. His face slowly changed. Johnny Carson watched. Elvis? No response. Elvis kept reading, then suddenly stopped. His breathing changed. The hand holding the paper began to tremble. Johnny Carson stepped closer. What does it say? Elvis looked at him, and for the first time that evening, he looked genuinely shaken. She heard this song when she was a little girl. Johnny Carson frowned. Her mother taught it to her? No, Elvis shook his head. She heard it from me. The room went silent. The boy stared at him. You? Elvis nodded slowly. Years ago. The boy's eyes widened. My mom saw you? Elvis looked at the paper again. I think, he paused. She did. Johnny Carson looked toward the audience. The story had suddenly become something nobody expected. This wasn't simply about a child missing his mother. There was a connection between Elvis and the boy's mother, a connection buried beneath decades of memory, a connection written in a letter. Elvis folded the paper carefully, then handed it back. But the boy didn't take it. Keep it, Elvis said. The boy shook his head. My mom wanted you to have it. Elvis looked stunned. Me? The boy nodded. She said, his voice became barely audible. If I ever met Elvis, he swallowed, I should give it to him. Elvis stared at the child. Johnny Carson stared at Elvis. Nobody knew what to say. Then Elvis slowly took the letter. He held it against his chest and whispered, Thank you. The boy looked at him, then asked the question that completely broke Elvis's composure. Did you know my mom? Elvis looked at him. For a long moment he couldn't answer. Then he finally said, I think I might. The boy's eyes widened. You do? Elvis nodded. But I need to remember. Johnny Carson stepped closer. Remember what? Elvis looked toward him, then at the boy. There was a night, his voice became quieter, a very long time ago. The studio seemed to lean toward him. Elvis continued. I was performing. Johnny Carson listened. There was a little girl in the audience. The boy froze. A little girl? Elvis nodded. She was crying. Why? I don't remember. Elvis looked down. But I remember stopping the show. The boy's eyes filled with tears. Was that my mom? Elvis looked at him and didn't answer. Not yet. Because somewhere inside his memory, a forgotten night was beginning to return. A little girl, a crowded room, a song, a promise, and a pair of eyes Elvis had never completely forgotten. He closed his eyes, then whispered, I think. He opened them. Your mother may have been the little girl. The boy covered his mouth. Johnny Carson stared at Elvis, and the audience erupted into whispers. But Elvis wasn't finished, because if his memory was right, then this wasn't a random song. It wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't simply a grieving child shouting from the audience. There was a reason his mother had spent years protecting that song. There was a reason she had written Elvis's name. And there was one final sentence in that old letter, a sentence the boy had never understood. Elvis unfolded the paper again. He read it, then his face went completely pale. Johnny Carson leaned toward him. "Elvis, what? What does it say?" Elvis slowly looked up. His voice was almost a whisper. She knew she was going to die. The room went silent. Johnny Carson's expression changed. The boy stared at Elvis. "What?" Elvis looked at the child, and then he read the final line of his mother's letter, a line that would turn the entire night into something far more painful than anyone could have imagined. "If my son ever hears this song again, tell him I was never really saying goodbye." Elvis lowered the letter, his eyes filled with tears, because suddenly he understood why the boy had screamed. He understood why the song had stopped him, and he understood why his mother had wanted him to hear it one more time. But there was still one question Elvis was afraid to ask. Why had she believed that Elvis Presley was the one person who could bring her son back to her? For several seconds, Elvis Presley couldn't move. The letter was still in his hand. The studio was silent. Johnny Carson was staring at him. The little boy was waiting for an answer. And somewhere behind all those television lights, thousands of people were holding their breath. Elvis looked down at the final sentence one more time. "If my son ever hears this song again, tell him I was never really saying goodbye." He slowly folded the letter, then looked at the boy. "Son," his voice almost broke, "your mother wasn't trying to make you sad." The boy wiped his eyes. "Then why did she write it?" Elvis took a long breath. "Because she wanted you to remember something." "What?" Elvis stepped closer. "She wanted you to know that love doesn't disappear just because someone does." The boy stared at him. Elvis placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes," he paused, "people leave the room. Sometimes they leave this world. But the things they gave us," he touched the boy's chest gently, "stay right here." The boy began crying again. Elvis pulled him into his arms. The audience watched in complete silence. For several seconds, Elvis simply held him. No performance, no cameras, no celebrity, just a man comforting a child who missed his mother. Johnny Carson looked down, then slowly turned toward the audience. When he spoke, his voice was unusually quiet. "I think everyone in this room understands what that song means now." Elvis nodded. But there was still something bothering him. The memory, the little girl, the night he thought he remembered. He looked at the boy's father. "Can I ask you something?" The father nodded. "Where did you say the box was?" "At home." "The wooden box?" "Yes." Elvis hesitated. "Did your wife ever tell you what was inside?" The father shook his head. "She told me it was personal." Elvis nodded. "Do you still have it?" "Yes." Elvis looked at the boy, then at Johnny Carson, and suddenly he made a decision. "Then I want you to open it." The father looked surprised. "Here." Elvis nodded. "If you're comfortable." The man reached into his jacket. For a moment, he looked confused. Then he pulled out a small photograph. The boy stared at it. His father's hand began shaking. "I brought this with me tonight." Elvis took the photograph, and the moment he saw it, his expression changed. Johnny Carson noticed immediately. "What is it?" Elvis didn't answer. He stared at the photograph. It showed a young girl, maybe 15 or 16 years old. She was standing in a crowd, and in the background was Elvis, much younger, much earlier in his career. The audience reacted. Johnny Carson stepped closer. "You know her," Elvis slowly nodded. "I think I do." The boy looked shocked. "You remember my mom?" Elvis looked at him. "I remember this night." The boy stared. "What happened?" Elvis took a breath. "I was performing." He looked at the photograph, and there was a girl near the front. The crowd was loud. She was crying. The boy whispered, "Why?" Elvis looked at him. "I stopped singing." The boy's eyes widened. "You stopped?" Elvis nodded. "She told me her mother was sick." The boy's father looked stunned. "That was my wife." Elvis nodded slowly. "I think so." The studio became silent again. Elvis continued. "She asked me to sing one particular song." The boy looked at the guitar. "The same song?" Elvis nodded. "The same song." The boy covered his mouth. Elvis looked at the photograph. I sang it. Then what? Elvis's eyes became distant. I remember telling her something. What? Elvis smiled sadly. I told her, he paused, that someday when she was older, she should sing it to someone she loved. The boy began crying. His father lowered his head, because suddenly the meaning of the mother's letter became clear. She had kept the memory for decades. She had passed the song to her son. And now, without knowing exactly why, that song had brought the boy to Elvis. The boy looked at Elvis. She did. Elvis nodded. I know. She sang it to me every night. Elvis's eyes filled with tears. And now you're singing it back. The boy nodded. Elvis smiled. Then she kept her promise. The audience began applauding softly, but Elvis raised his hand. He wasn't finished. He turned toward the band. Can we do something? The musicians nodded. Elvis looked at the boy. You want to sing it again? The boy smiled through his tears. Yes. Elvis took his guitar. The lights softened. Johnny Carson stepped away from the center of the stage. The audience became silent, and Elvis began playing. One slow chord, then another. The boy stood beside him. This time, he didn't look frightened. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at the crowd. He simply closed his eyes and began to sing. The first note filled the room. Elvis joined him. Their voices were completely different. One belonged to a legendary performer. The other belonged to a child carrying his mother's memory. But together, they sounded strangely perfect. The audience listened. The boy sang the way his mother had taught him. Elvis followed his rhythm, and somewhere in that studio, something beautiful happened. The boy stopped crying. For the first time that night, he smiled. A real smile. The kind of smile a child gives when he suddenly feels safe. Elvis noticed. He smiled too. The song continued. The boy reached the part that had once been impossible for him, the part that always reminded him of losing his mother. But this time, he didn't break. He sang it, loudly, clearly. And Elvis looked at him with pride. When the final note came, Elvis didn't immediately stop playing. He let the last chord breathe, then slowly lowered the guitar. The studio was silent, but this silence was different. It wasn't grief, it was respect. Then Johnny Carson walked onto the stage. He looked at the boy, then at Elvis, then toward the audience. I think, he paused, we just watched something we'll never see again. The audience stood. Applause exploded. But Elvis wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the boy. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small handkerchief, and gently wiped the child's tears. Then he said, Your mom gave you something nobody can take away. The boy looked up. What? Her voice. The boy smiled. Elvis continued. And now, he pointed toward the audience. You've given it to all of us. The boy hugged him again. Elvis hugged him tightly. The cameras moved closer. Johnny Carson looked away for a moment. The audience continued applauding. Then Elvis suddenly remembered something. He turned to the boy's father. I want to ask you one more thing. The father nodded. Does your son have a record player? Yes, Elvis smiled. Good. He turned toward the boy. Then when you go home, the boy listened. Play this song. The boy nodded. But this time, Elvis paused. Don't cry. The boy smiled. Why? Because your mom isn't saying goodbye anymore. The boy's eyes filled again. Elvis placed his hand over the boy's heart. She already said what she needed to say. The boy nodded. Elvis looked at him. And you answered her. The studio erupted in applause. The boy hugged Elvis one final time, then slowly walked toward his father. He stopped halfway, turned around, and looked back at Elvis. Thank you. Elvis smiled. No, he shook his head. Thank your mom. The boy nodded. And then he left the stage. Elvis watched him disappear into the audience. For a moment, he simply stood there. Johnny Carson came beside him. He looked at Elvis. You all right? Elvis nodded, but his eyes were still fixed on the boy. Carson smiled sadly. You know, he paused. I've interviewed a lot of people. Elvis looked at him, but I've never seen anything like that. Elvis looked down at his guitar, then quietly said, Neither have I. Johnny Carson asked, Do you think you'll ever sing that song the same way again? Elvis was silent. He looked toward the empty space where the boy had been standing, then shook his head. No. Carson looked surprised. Why not? Elvis answered softly. Because now, he paused. Every time I sing it, he looked toward the audience. I'll hear her voice. The studio fell silent one final time. Elvis raised the guitar, but he didn't play. He simply held it. And for a moment, the superstar who had spent years performing in front of millions looked like an ordinary man remembering someone he had once met long ago. The lights began to fade. The cameras slowly pulled back. Johnny Carson stood beside him. The audience remained on its feet. And somewhere among them, a little boy was holding the memory of his mother a little differently than he had when the night began. He had walked into the studio carrying grief. He walked out carrying a song, not a song about losing his mother, a song about finding her again. Because sometimes a person doesn't disappear completely. Sometimes they leave behind a voice, a melody, a photograph, a sentence written on an old piece of paper, and sometimes, years after they are gone, one unexpected moment brings all of it back. That night, Elvis Presley didn't simply stop a song. He stopped a television performance. He stopped a room full of people. He stopped an entire audience from looking at him as a superstar. And for a few unforgettable minutes, he became something much more important. He became the person who helped one little boy hear his mother's voice again. The audience kept applauding. The cameras kept rolling. But Elvis never looked at the cameras. He looked toward the boy. And just before the broadcast faded away, Elvis quietly said something that Johnny Carson would later remember for the rest of his life. Some songs aren't meant to be performed. He looked down at his guitar. They're meant to be remembered. The lights went dark, and the song ended. But for that little boy, it never really would. Because from that night forward, whenever he heard those first few notes, he wouldn't remember the night his mother disappeared. He would remember the night. Elvis Presley helped bring her voice back. And that was the moment the boy finally understood what his mother had meant all along. She hadn't left him a goodbye. She had left him a song,